Good evening to you, everybody. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to the Hurricane Hub discussion for June 5th, 2023. We have several things to go over today, though not much in terms of current activity related. First of all, there is, of course, by the title card, you could tell, a new area of interest in the northern Atlantic that the NHC tagged. It's all the way out there, far from the deep tropics, so not much of concern. And then we're going to take a look at the European seasonal data as it relates to the Atlantic, not only with the models, but also with what's currently going out there. Because let me tell you, it is definitely getting interesting. So let's waste no time in getting started. Of course, move right along, no sputtering. First of all, starting off with the Atlantic, we're gonna go to this here. As I mentioned, it really is all the way out there. We really don't see development in this part of the Atlantic at this time of year. So already kind of one thing that you could kind of guess that it's not really much of a concern for development anyway. And the NHC has it at a 10% chance within the next 48 hours and 7 days. So there's really no concern. And we could go to the 7-day graphical weather outlook, and you can see it's just a small area where it has to maybe develop. So not much of a concern at all. It's also really non-tropical in nature, so really wouldn't worry about it. And then the Eastern Pacific is nice and quiet. How long will that remain? We'll have to see. But as I did mention before, I'll show it to you on satellite where the NHC tagged this thing. It's right in here, and you can just take a look at it. It's very broad. There's a lot of sheer upper level winds, strong upper level winds, which is one thing that is not very favorable for development of tropical, and in this case, subtropical systems. And you could also just see there's not a lot of deep convection associated with this too. When it comes to subtropical development, at least the path. This is the passage, the formation pathway it would take, especially in the area that it is, would be more or less a subtropical development. We would still expect moderate or so convective activity, and we really don't have much of that associated with this. And any convective activity that is occurring is kind of spread out, so you can already guess it's not really much of a chance to worry about for any sort of development. Nonetheless, it is still there, and it'll definitely bring impacts to the Azores, as it is still some sort of system out there, just not really in the tropical or subtropical tracking nature that we usually look for. And then you could also take a look here, coming off the coast of Africa, another very strong, robust tropical wave moving off, and you've been seeing multiple of these throughout the year so far, since mid-May when we started getting these tropical waves. As soon as they've just been coming off, they've been really strong, and this new one that's coming off is no exception to that. Of course, though, it's not going to develop because there's a lot of dry air, and of course wind shear as well, which will inhibit the development of this. But it's June anyway, we really don't expect much to occur. But on to the talk of the town, at least for today's discussion, that's the sea surface temperature anomalies. And if you could tell by the tabs, we're basically going to spend the rest of the discussion looking at the Atlantic in terms of parameters, because just look at this. And when I tell you that it's just getting more surprising how impressive these sea surface temperature anomalies are, you better believe it, because look at this. We are starting to see in the eastern Atlantic 2, even 3 degrees Celsius patches along the sea surface temperature anomaly chart reappear in the eastern Atlantic, especially off the coast of Africa, and right where a lot of people especially look for when it comes to a classic warm AMO, as we call it, Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, basically just meaning the phases of whether or not the Atlantic is warm or cold, and they go back and forth between those phases, usually within a span of 20, 40 years. And this is the area that people usually look for, especially in correlation to active seasons. They look for this to be the warmest part of the Atlantic, and you can just see where that is, especially if you compare this to early May. Remember when we were seeing basically anomalies off the chart? Well, of course, that is cooled down from that, but we're starting to see these really warm 3-4 degrees Celsius even anomalies begin to reappear. And even take a look at that in the Caribbean. You could see that as well, and I'll even zoom it out on a global scale, and you could just see almost a perfect, and honestly, I'm going to have to say straight up that this is probably one of the best positive AMO signatures I've seen in real time in present day, honestly. this almost perfect, basically not even almost, basically completely perfect backward C shape, stretching from the northern Atlantic near Greenland down into the Canary Currents, and then into the MDR. And not even just the Canary Current. Just look at right here off the Iberian Peninsula and off the northern part of the northern Atlantic, right near Greenland and Iceland as well, which is also a place that matters. You could see 3, even 4 degrees Celsius there too. And that's stretching down all the way into the MDR. Basically, that is one heck of a signature if you're looking for it, at least in Atlantic activity. And then you also have the cold subtropics, especially off the East Coast on top of that. Classic positive AMO signature, really. But this would really be something for active hurricane season if it wasn't for this developing El Nino, which we're still having an El Nino occur. But honestly, even then, could the Atlantic overpower this El Nino? And that's honestly been a question that I've really been thinking about for the last few weeks. And some other meteorologists too, of course, on Twitter. Of course, a lot of them been taking note of this and wondering whether or not this has correlation to maybe, or not correlation, but some sort of impact on the El Nino or the effects of El Nino in the Atlantic. It's a really big question that we'll really have to see in real time what occurs. But we're still having El Nino. We can still see very warm anomalies too, even beginning to develop in the Eastern Pacific. But gotta mention this colder look off the west coast of the United States and off the Baja Peninsula. That is more or less of a signature of a cool PDO, a negative northern Pacific, which is a lot more of a signature that you would see in La Ninas rather than El Nino. Not that we're going to get a La Nina, because we're not at all. There's no chance for that, really. But that's more or less a signature that we tend to have in La Ninas. So you would really, you really just gotta honestly beg the question: how do these two influence whatever impacts comes from the El Nino? Of course, bearing in mind that this doesn't just completely warm up and we begin to see a flip towards a more positive PDO, which is what some are thinking will probably occur later this year. But still, you just gotta think what happens, what will happen, and how will this really impact the overall pattern this year. And of course, sometimes to get an idea of what we do, that of what could occur. If you've been with me long enough, you know that sometimes I do this from time to time, and I just did this in my predictions that I released on Thursday on my live stream. If you've not seen it, check it out. I'll probably post a video going over my predictions anyways in a day or so stay tuned for that. But we're going to compare this year to past years, starting off with 2020, the infamous 2020 now, 30 named storms. That was a really active year, and just look at that. Compare that, look at the Northern Atlantic and look at the MDR and compare that to this year. God, we're miles ahead of that. I'll give it to 2020, maybe that, I guess the Northern Atlantic, the subtropical Atlantic, not the Northern Atlantic, but the subtropical Atlantic is maybe more colder. We have more widespread anomalies of colder sea surface temperatures in the subtropics. But just take a look at the positive AMO signature in 2020 and compare it to how it is this year. It just doesn't get more defined than how we have it this year. So that's 2020, and then on to 2010, going in decreasing year order. And this is 2010. First we had 2020, then 2010. Another year that's also very much a year that we kind of use as a benchmark, more or less, for sea surface temperature anomalies in the Atlantic, because 2010 was the warmest AMO year on record. And compare that to 2010 and look at how it will look now, especially out here in the Eastern Atlantic. It's so much warmer, especially over there. And I guess it's because most of the warmth in the Atlantic, I guess, was more confined towards the central MDR and more western parts of the MDRs, where we saw the majority of the warmth. But I don't know, still compare that to this year. It's close, I'll tell you. It's really close, especially in the MDR. It's very close. The difference between this year and 2010. Of course, the bigger difference, though, is the very cold Pacific. Not only did we have this cold area off the Baja Peninsula, almost forgot the name, and of course the west coast of the United States. Not only that, it was a lot more defined then too, of course, because we were also heading towards what would be a very strong La Nina that year. And then finally we have the all infamous 2005, which even then, take a look at the MDR and compare that to this year. Let's find this year. We're honestly warmer than 2005. I don't know. Does this look warmer to you, or this does? I think this does. And even in the Caribbean too. The 2005 was very warm in the Caribbean, but my phone's ringing, but didn't have these anomalies that were 2-3 degrees Celsius in the central and western Caribbean, as opposed to this year. You see that. So all around, very interesting comparison. And not saying that this year is going to be a 2005, and I guess I could give it to that year too, being a little more condensed warmth in the subtropics, a little more widespread than you would have supposed this year. This year more or less has it just off the Canadian Maritimes, which is generally where we would look for it. This part of the Eastern Atlantic being this warm too is also very important for the positive in helping enhance the positive AMO signature that we typically look for. But still, you just got to compare to these 2 years, and man, I don't know what to say. This year, really, if it wasn't for the El Nino, I'd probably bet you that all of us would be going ham on our seasonal predictions, because whatever is happening this year is definitely very surprising and very incredible, to say the least. And people are taking note of it. Andy Hazelton, while skeptical, he is mentioning the European forecast, which did release today, the European seasonal. He mentions last year's June European forecast obviously busted notably high, and then he does mention because in conjunction with El Nino developing, he does believe maybe we'll be in for a repeat of the European overcasting in terms of how it looks in the Atlantic. But still, this is the latest data, if it could load up. But the European forecasting 1.4, I think it's standard deviations. Yeah, that's right. 1.4 standard deviations compared to the average in the Atlantic, which is 1.0. And apparently I think the European was forecasting nearly 2 standard deviations above normal last year. But generally, what it means is just the European is forecasting an above normal season, and you could even take a look at it on this map too. European seasonal forecast 1.4 standard deviations as opposed to the average being 1 point. So it's definitely looking like a active season that the European is forecasting. And even take a look at here on the sea surface temperature anomaly chart, very defined positive AMO signature that they're initializing. So maybe it's also because they're taking into consideration how warm the Atlantic is. And you can even see here, this is for July, August, September, and you can see the sea surface temperature anomaly profile that they have in the Pacific. They have that colder Pacific pool remaining along the western coast of the United States and the Baja Peninsula. And then in turn, we get this, and this is, by the way, the European seasonal precipitation anomaly forecast for the peak season, August, September, October. This is actually 2022. Oops. Never mind. I was going to show the precipitation, or maybe they have this wrong. I don't know, because it says initialized as of 2023, June 1st. So maybe they have this wrong. But generally, what all of the models been saying so far, very active look in the Atlantic, stretching all the way from Africa even. And then you kind of see this pattern that kind of takes the track. If you want to use, of course, precipitation forecasts for potential track areas that some people like to do, I do like to do that as well. But you can see it all the way from Africa, and then kind of you could draw a track maybe into the southwestern Atlantic, almost a continuous streak of above normal precipitation, well above normal precipitation, and then kind of lays right off the east coast of the United States and even Florida too, and the southwestern Atlantic, the Bahamas as well included. Maybe it's hinting at some sort of track that does that. And if that doesn't happen, if that does happen this year, and we do get an above normal season, that'll be interesting. Definitely, but as at least in relation to the sea surface temperature anomalies, I'll tell you right now, this is the sea surface temperature anomaly forecast. Then not the forecast. This is the current sea surface temperature anomalies, specifically in the Atlantic MDR by the NOAA Coral Reef Watch from Cyclonic Weather by Alex Bourne. Of course, got to give credit, and you could just see it skyrocketing, especially in the recent data points. Look at how it just skyrockets completely to the top, and this is already breached 1 degree Celsius. So the MDR basically is a full degree Celsius above normal. How often do you see that? Really, how often do you see that? And I'll just say, because sometimes people like to talk about whether or not this does happen, but honestly, we'll have to see how this persists, because you take into consideration this, and of course you take into consideration this European seasonal forecast that we have that's just been released. It's really hard to find. It's really hard to believe or kind of think how this will kind of just all reverse in just a matter of a few weeks. Because sometimes people do like to point out, sometimes if the NAO, the North Atlantic Oscillation, trends positive, and models start to forecast trades in the Atlantic, stronger trades, everybody starts getting the idea, oh, the Atlantic is going to cool down and we're not going to see a strong positive AMO look as much for the peak season. Hint, it's already happened this year so far, last month. I remember everyone at the beginning of the month was saying stronger trade winds forecast for the Atlantic's going to cool down. And now here we are going the opposite direction, and we're now skyrocketing upwards. And if you remember us talking about it yesterday too, the zonal wind forecast in the Atlantic, basically showing westerly winds, weaker trade winds, and even reversal of trade winds in the Atlantic for at least the next week or so. And we're already seeing this beginning to skyrocket. You can just only imagine how much more will go up in the Atlantic, and you can just only imagine the type of influence that would have, especially when it comes to seasonal forecasts. And will that honestly grab the attention of more people that maybe we might actually end up seeing a more active season than we thought, especially given the idea that we are having a pending El Nino on top of the very warm Atlantic that we have. Could there be some sort of canceling factor that causes the Atlantic to be more active and kind of cancel out the El Nino effects from significantly impacting the basin? We'll have to see. In my opinion, people honestly should, though, start paying attention to this, because even on whether or not this year will be active, it is always important to note that it could really just take one storm, not to be a bad storm in general for the season, but to be a bad storm for you specifically. No matter what season it is, whether it's a hyperactive season with 35 named storms or a dead season with 7, one storm is all it takes to be bad for you and cause significant damage for you, or even life loss as well. So it really doesn't always take a season where we have 2-3 big large scale impact storms and in turn the season is very memorable, although it definitely is possible this year, but we'll have to see whether or not that happens. Just remember, it always takes one, and that's why hurricane preparedness is always important no matter what, especially now, because we're still early on. Yes, we're no longer in the off season. The off season's done, we're finished, we're now here in the actual season itself. But keep in mind, it's going to take a while, and that reminds me, for tomorrow I will actually bring a climatology graph to show how far we really just are in the season and how far we have much to go. It's actually quite surprising when you look at the climatology map. We're definitely just really beginning, so you still have time to prepare, and always keep in mind preparedness is most important, because you don't want to be caught in the crossfires last second. But of course, since there is nothing going on right now, you won't be caught in the crossfires now. So nothing is going on right now in the next 2 weeks, and it does look like it'll stay that way. Maybe, of course, towards the mid to later June, and some people are saying that it could start getting a little more interesting. We'll have to see, but since we don't have anything else going on, as I'm just going to wrap it up. Enjoy the rest of your evening. If you did like what you saw today, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. That's the only way we're really going to be able to grow. And of course, it's always good to get the information out there to everyone, so when there is something coming, we have more people not only prepared but knowledgeable about what's going on, because honestly, it all comes down, in my opinion, to knowledge, which is the most important thing, not only for hurricane preparedness but for hurricane tracking, not only real time but also long range and climate wise. Knowledge is a very, very important and very vital thing to have. So very important for that. But I'm gonna wrap it up. Nice talking to all of you. Hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and we will talk again soon.